The United States is standing at the edge of a fiscal cliff, and the so-called Big Beautiful Bill might just be the final push. Heralded as a sweeping reform by its proponents, this legislative juggernaut has ignited a storm of controversy. On the surface, it promises economic revitalization and reduced government bloat. But beneath the surface lies a debt trap of unprecedented proportions. With national debt already spiraling past $34 trillion, critics argue that this bill could escalate America's financial vulnerability beyond recovery. As headlines praise its ambition and opponents warn of its recklessness, one question grows louder. Will this beautiful bill bankrupt America? At its foundation, the Big Beautiful Bill represents one of the most ambitious and far-reaching legislative efforts in recent memory, designed to overhaul the federal government's fiscal architecture in one sweeping motion. Marketed by its architects as a blueprint for American renewal, the bill promises to recalibrate spending priorities, deliver broad-based tax relief, and radically reshape the nation's approach to entitlement programs. Advocates point to generous tax cuts extending across income tiers, aggressive deregulation aimed at unleashing corporate productivity, and a substantial infusion of funds into defense, framed as an essential investment in national strength. In addition, the legislation proposes the elimination of numerous federal programs labeled inefficient or outdated, while dramatically expanding subsidies and incentives for domestic manufacturing and fossil fuel production, with the stated goal of securing energy independence and reviving American industry. More controversially, it calls for the full repeal of major climate initiatives and a restructuring of welfare systems to emphasize personal responsibility over federal support. Proponents argue that these reforms reflect a core philosophy centered on individual freedom, economic competitiveness, and a scaled-back federal presence. Yet the interconnected nature of its provisions ensures that its reach will extend far beyond spreadsheets and Senate chambers. From education and healthcare to infrastructure and environmental policy, virtually every corner of American society is poised to feel the tremors. What makes this bill truly monumental is not only its legislative breadth, but the complex, cascading impact it may unleash across the nation's long-term social and economic trajectory. The latest analysis from the Congressional Budget Office, CBO, offers a chilling forecast. The Big Beautiful Bill could drive the national debt up by an additional $3.5 trillion to $6 trillion over the next 10 years. This projected explosion stems primarily from sweeping tax cuts that are not paired with offsetting reductions in federal spending, creating an immediate and gaping hole in government revenue. While the bill's proponents emphasize long-term entitlement reform as a stabilizing force, most of those savings are delayed, offering little fiscal relief in the near term. As a result, the U.S. debt-to-GDP ratio could soar past 130%, approaching the same alarming levels seen during the peak of World War II. Supporters of the bill dismiss these numbers, pointing instead to rosy economic projections fueled by supply-side optimism. They argue that unleashing business investment and personal spending will yield a growth boom strong enough to refill federal coffers through increased tax revenues. However, independent economists and fiscal watchdogs remain unconvinced. Even under the most favorable growth assumptions, revenue gains fall far short of covering the bill's costs. The gamble here is immense. It hinges on the continued availability of low-interest borrowing and the unwavering confidence of global creditors. Should either falter, should interest rates rise or foreign investors grow wary, the cost of servicing the debt could balloon rapidly, consuming federal resources and edging the nation toward a sovereign debt crisis. In that scenario, the bill could mark not just a fiscal misstep, but a foundational threat to America's economic sovereignty. If you're finding this breakdown informative, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a deep dive into the policies shaping your future. Economists remain sharply divided over the Big Beautiful Bill's projected impact on key macroeconomic indicators such as GDP growth, job creation, and inflation. A number of analysts anticipate a near-term economic jolt, estimating a temporary 1% to 1.5% rise in GDP during the first 2 years. This bump would stem from immediate tax relief and deregulation, which are expected to incentivize corporate investment and lower operational costs. Sectors that receive targeted benefits, like manufacturing and fossil fuels, may experience a surge in activity and employment, lending early credibility to the bill's stimulative claims. But beyond the short horizon, the optimism fades. A growing consensus among economists paints a more sobering picture. Critics point to the bill's glaring neglect of long-term economic enablers. There is little funding for infrastructure modernization, scientific research, or technological innovation, all of which are central to sustainable growth. Compounding the concern is the anticipated ballooning of federal deficits, which many warn will crowd out private investment by competing for capital in the financial markets. As federal borrowing intensifies, so too could interest rates, making it more expensive for businesses to expand and consumers to borrow. This fiscal pressure risks neutralizing any early gains. Equally troubling is the looming threat of inflation. With massive government borrowing flooding the economy with liquidity, unaccompanied by proportional output gains, prices are likely to rise. Should the Federal Reserve be forced to tighten monetary policy in response, the result could be an economic chokehold, stifling growth, and potentially tipping the country into recession. The prevailing concern is that what starts as a politically expedient boost may devolve into a prolonged period of economic stagnation. The bill, critics argue, trades short-lived stimulus for long-term instability, a high-risk exchange that could leave the nation worse off than before. Advocates of the Big Beautiful Bill, chief among them the White House Council of Economic Advisers, offer a confident, though widely contested, defense of its sweeping reforms. At the heart of their argument lies a familiar playbook rooted in supply-side economics. Slash corporate and individual taxes, strip away regulatory red tape, and allow the market to do the rest. By placing more capital directly in the hands of businesses and households, they believe the bill will unleash a wave of investment, innovation, and workforce participation. This heightened economic activity, in theory, will expand the tax base and generate enough revenue to not only sustain government operations, but ultimately reduce the deficit over time. Proponents point to the bill's strategic cuts as evidence of fiscal responsibility, a calculated trimming of federal fat without compromising essential services. Welfare reforms, too, are framed as tools of empowerment, designed to incentivize work and reduce long-term dependency on government assistance. Yet this optimistic narrative rests on a foundation that history has repeatedly called into question. From the Reagan tax cuts to the Bush-era reductions, previous promises that tax relief would spur self-sustaining growth and deficit reduction have fallen short. Instead of surpluses, those periods often yielded ballooning deficits and heightened volatility. The underlying assumption that growth alone can pay for deep tax cuts remains one of the most polarizing debates in modern economic policy. Critics argue that this bill is not a bold leap toward prosperity, but a familiar wager on a theory that has failed to deliver on its promises. The question lingers: are we witnessing sound economic strategy or a repackaged gamble on fiscal optimism? Opposition to the Big Beautiful Bill has coalesced into a powerful and diverse front, uniting fiscally conservative Republicans with centrist Democrats under a shared banner of skepticism. Their charge is blunt. The bill is built not on sound economics, but on magical thinking, a fragile edifice of overly rosy projections and evasive accounting. Respected institutions like the Congressional Budget Office and Yale's Budget Lab have closely scrutinized the bill's underlying assumptions, particularly the belief in a sustained 4% long-term GDP growth rate. Such projections, they argue, are untethered from historical precedent and current economic fundamentals, serving more as political wish-casting than reliable forecasts. But the criticisms run deeper. One of the bill's more controversial features is its reliance on so-called sunset clauses, temporary provisions that make costly tax breaks and spending programs appear affordable by setting artificial expiration dates. While these clauses technically reduce the bill's long-term price tag on paper, critics note that Congress rarely allows popular benefits to expire, effectively disguising trillions in additional obligations. It's a legislative sleight of hand, one that shifts the burden to future lawmakers and misleads the public about the bill's real impact. To many, the bill resembles a Trojan horse, attractively packaged, but hiding a devastating fiscal payload. The gulf between its lofty promises and its structural realities has stoked a rising tide of distrust, not just in Washington, but across financial markets and among global investors who have long viewed U.S. fiscal policy as a gold standard. That credibility, once ironclad, now appears increasingly fragile under the weight of creative accounting and economic overreach. One of the most immediate and ominous consequences of the Big Beautiful Bill is playing out in real time across the global bond markets. Within hours of its narrow Senate approval, the yield on 10-year U.S. Treasuries, the gold standard for international lending, climbed sharply, signaling rising investor unease. That increase, though seemingly technical, reflects a deeper anxiety. Lenders are demanding higher returns to compensate for what they now perceive as heightened fiscal risk. In plain terms, it's getting more expensive for the United States to borrow money. This erosion of confidence is far from theoretical. Credit rating giant Moody's has issued pointed warnings, suggesting a downgrade in the country's sovereign debt could be imminent if the bill becomes law without meaningful deficit control. Such a downgrade would strike a serious blow to America's financial prestige and immediately drive up borrowing costs further. At the same time, there are troubling signs of retreat among longtime foreign buyers of U.S. debt, namely China and Japan, whose waning appetite could force the Treasury to raise interest rates even higher to attract replacement investors. That, in turn, would deepen the debt spiral. This creates a perilous feedback loop. The more the government borrows to cover deficits, the more it must pay to do so, which inflates those very deficits even further. What was once an abstract concern about fiscal sustainability is now morphing into a full-fledged crisis of credibility. The Big Beautiful Bill, by ignoring fiscal guardrails, may be weakening the very pillars of trust that underpin America's economic power and global influence. The political machinery driving the Big Beautiful Bill is as volatile and fragmented as the policy itself, exposing sharp divisions, reluctant loyalties, and high-stakes calculations across party lines. While moderate Republicans have largely presented a front of unity, behind closed doors, many express deep unease about the bill's long-term fiscal consequences. Yet the demands of party loyalty, donor expectations, and looming elections have created an atmosphere of coercive consensus, where dissent is muted in favor of strategic optics. This internal tension highlights a fundamental struggle between principled governance and political survival. Though heralded by its architects as a sweeping engine for economic growth, the Big Beautiful Bill draws an unmistakable line between winners and losers, redrawing the social contract in ways that many argue favor capital over people. At the top of the ledger sit large corporations and wealthy investors, buoyed by deep corporate tax cuts and widespread deregulation. These measures are designed to increase profitability, open the door to aggressive stock buybacks, and unlock higher executive compensation. Proponents argue this will catalyze private investment and job growth. Yet for every dollar funneled upward, the bill exacts a painful toll on society's most vulnerable. Core social safety nets, Medicaid, food assistance programs like SNAP, and key housing initiatives face substantial cuts, jeopardizing basic support for millions of low-income Americans. Education grants are also on the chopping block, potentially limiting access to higher learning and straining families already burdened with debt. Environmental regulations, too, are gutted, raising alarms about pollution, public health, and long-term climate impacts. Meanwhile, subsidies for politically influential sectors like fossil fuels and industrial agriculture are expanded, reinforcing the cloud of entrenched corporate interests. While small businesses and working-class households may see modest, short-lived tax relief, it pales in comparison to the permanent gains locked in for top earners and multinational firms. The redistribution embedded in this bill is not subtle. It shifts public resources from the many to the privileged few. Critics from across the political and academic spectrum argue that far from lifting all boats, the legislation deepens inequality, frays the social fabric, and reorients national priorities around profit, not people. For a bill pitched as transformative, its legacy may well be a more divided, less equitable America. For millions of everyday Americans, the Big Beautiful Bill is not an abstract legislative maneuver. it is a financial reality that could reshape their lives in deeply personal ways. As federal debt balloons and investor confidence wavers, rising borrowing costs are expected to spill over into consumer finance. That means higher interest rates on mortgages, car loans, student debt, and credit cards, translating into larger monthly payments and shrinking household budgets. The dream of homeownership may slip further out of reach, and financial strain could become a defining feature of middle-class life. Compounding the pressure, sweeping cuts to essential programs like Medicaid and SNAP are poised to strip vulnerable families of vital lifelines. Millions could face reduced access to healthcare, higher out-of-pocket costs, and deteriorating health outcomes. Cuts to food assistance risk deepening food insecurity, particularly in already marginalized communities. While the bill does extend some tax relief to middle-income earners, these benefits are modest and temporary, set to expire within a few years. In contrast, the corporate and high-income tax breaks are permanent, reinforcing long-term disparities. Inflation adds another layer of concern, as government borrowing injects more money into the economy without corresponding output. The resulting price hikes will erode purchasing power, diminish savings, and raise the cost of everyday necessities. Should global markets grow wary of U.S. fiscal credibility, the repercussions could extend to Wall Street, triggering volatility that imperils retirement accounts and pension plans. In a cascading effect, businesses may respond to the uncertainty by slowing hiring or cutting jobs. The prevailing fear is that while the bill delivers windfalls to the wealthy and corporate elite, it leaves Main Street to foot the bill, absorbing the risks, costs, and consequences of a policy sold as a national triumph. The Big Beautiful Bill is more than just a sweeping piece of legislation. It is a high-stakes declaration of ideology, an audacious attempt to reshape the nation's economic architecture, and arguably, one of the boldest fiscal experiments in modern American history. To its champions, it is a long-overdue course correction, a return to free market fundamentals, deregulation, and individual empowerment, designed to reignite entrepreneurial dynamism and chart a path toward broad-based prosperity. They see in it the embodiment of economic liberty and national renewal. But to its critics, a diverse and increasingly vocal chorus, it represents something far more dangerous. They warn that the bill is a fiscal Trojan horse, wrapped in populist appeal but riddled with structural weaknesses, unsustainable deficits, and regressive priorities. With the national debt now exceeding $34 trillion and global investors beginning to question the reliability of America's fiscal compass, the risks associated with this legislation are no longer theoretical. They are unfolding in real time. The choice before the nation is stark. Are we witnessing a bold leap into economic renaissance, or a reckless descent into long-term instability? This isn't just a policy debate. It's a defining moment for America's financial future. What do you think? Is the Big Beautiful Bill a visionary breakthrough or a catastrophic misstep? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear where you stand. And if you found this deep dive helpful, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more critical analysis of the policies shaping our world. The stakes are high, the consequences are real, and the conversation is only just beginning.